Rodney, make us proud.
Wow, very nice. Well, when I saw that this was to be debated, I wasn't entirely sure how to approach it. I completely agree with everything that's been said. I think that for one thing, no one physician that I'm aware of can do all of these things. And so I kind of approached this with two assumptions. One was that closing the appendage, well, three assumptions. One, that closing the appendage is a worthwhile endeavor. Two, that if the decision is to close the appendage surgically, there really shouldn't be a debate. I have no business in that space. I think it was Mark Gillenoff that said that he looks at atria every day. And I thought when he was saying that, you know, when I actually look at an open chest atrium, it's a really bad day for me. So, very true. So here are my disclosures. I do have one conflict of interest. I am a gainfully employed electrophysiologist, and I would like to remain so. So who should close the left atrial appendage? There are three approaches that have been presented the last couple of days. Surgical closure, endovascular closure, and the percutaneous epicardial or non-surgical closure. And like I said a minute ago, presumably if the decision is that a appendage should be closed surgically, whether it's with a concomitant procedure or as a standalone procedure, for example, that failed lariat that I showed yesterday was referred for a surgical closure. We didn't feel like any of the endovascular approaches would do. So it really just highlights the fact that we do need a team approach. There are things I'd like to think I can do it all, but I can't. And I know it, I recognize it, and I need to have good relationships with cardiologists because sometimes they can help me and surgeons can sometimes save my bacon. So that's critical. So I'm going to focus, at least for the purposes of this talk, on the endovascular and the percutaneous epicardial approaches in that who should be doing those. So this is more, should it be EPs, should it be interventional cardiologists, should it be both? And I'm going to focus really only on the key skills because this is certainly, this harmonizes with the last two talks because I completely agree we need a team approach. But let's focus on these skill sets and make sure that if you are going to be the one closing an appendage either endovascularly or epicardially, that these are the skills that are indeed mastered. So transeptal approach was developed really decades ago, and as was mentioned in the last talk, all of the original paper and all of the original work was done in the cath lab. Really busy cath labs would do maybe 100, maybe 200 a year, and this was a skill that was routinely taught to cardiology fellows. So this would have been in the 70s and 80s when balloon valvuloplasties were common. In the EP lab, once RF was initiated in the late 80s, early 90s, it became appropriate to be trained in that for WW cases. And in fact, when I first started my EP fellowship, the person training me had never done transeptals, the electrophysiologist, and so about a year into my fellowship, I wanted to learn transeptal, and who did I go to? I went to the interventional cardiologist. And they were a busy, quote-unquote, site at the time. This was in, I think, 91. They were doing about 20 a year, and that was considered high volume. And so they trained me on how to do it. This predated ICE. We put a pigtail catheter in the aortic root to show mainly what not to stick. And you used two obliquities of fluoro. You used pressure transducer to know when you're in the left atrium. When I think back on it, it's kind of frightening, but that's how I learned. And so I credit them for teaching me how to do transeptals. So by the 1990s, it was really not done very much in cath labs. The place where I trained in Dallas was still kind of high volume at the time. 20 cases a year is not terribly high volume now. And it was becoming more common in the EP labs. This is an article that was published in '87, and it was sort of lamenting the fact that it was a lost skill. And this is really before structural heart became a real thing. So there wasn't any percutaneous structural heart guys. So in the cath lab, lots of places just stopped training for it. And it's kind of ironic that that's when it was really building up in the EP lab. This is a survey article that was looking at some high volume centers in Europe. A lot of that's too small to see. This is just kind of shows the indications that were used in the electrophysiology lab pre-ice in how they were getting to the left atrium and why they were getting to the left atrium. The bulk of them were for AFib. There's a few other things, some VT, some accessory pathways, things like that. Here was another example of how they did it. So in the 33 centers that were in this survey, about half of them were using pressure recordings only. 11 of them were using nothing. 2 of them were using transesophageal echo. 4 of them were using intracardiac echo, and 5 of them did it. When I was trained, I kind of did these two. So we were taught to put a pigtail in the aortic root, and we were taught to look at the pressure change from the right atrium to the left atrium. So when you look at the experience, and so this was over a 12-year span, the first 11 years and then the last year here, complication rates, well, procedures were aborted around just under 1% of the time. The reasons for being aborted, you just couldn't find the fossa. This is all pre-ice, of course. You had a left atrial septum that seemed resistant, and they were uncomfortable without a lot of advanced imaging to push too hard, which I think is smart. Needle punctured the right atrium, needle punctured the aortic root. So these things did happen, and these were in high volume centers. Complication rates were just under 1%. This is pre-ice. And these were the volumes. So if you think about I could have an overlay of volumes in cath labs, at least until structural heart came about, and the volumes were kind of doing the opposite. They were going down to practically nothing in the cath lab, whereas in the EP lab it increased to impressive numbers just because of ablation of AFib. So here is just a slide showing the number of sites that did AFib, over 95% of the reasons for going transeptal versus some that had less likely episodes. So here was another article looking at just some important caveats, what you think about with transeptal catheterization. This one's a little bit hard to read, but this is talking about the things that define a high-risk transeptal, for example, a thicker septum or a repeat procedure, lipomatous hypertrophy. My eyes can't quite read all of this, but I remember this slide. If somebody had an ASD closure, if somebody had surgical closure of the interatrial septum, all these things were considered higher risk, and I think rightfully so. But experience matters. I guess that's the point. Imaging and experience matters. In our experience, just in the last 4 years, I pulled our number of punctures. We've done almost 7,000 transeptal punctures in 4 years. 95% of them were for AFib, 5% were for other things, BT, SVT, things like that. I'm pretty sure all of them we used intracardiac echo, and in 9,000 or almost 7,000 cases, we didn't have any complications related to the puncture. So what it shows is that even with, and what I didn't have time to pull out of this was how many of them were ASD closure devices, at least 3 that I know of off the top of my head. We had at least 20 that had surgical closures. We had hundreds that were lipomatous hypertrophy, things that would have been defined as high risk. So what it shows is that if you really can image and know exactly where you are, you have the experience to know what you can get away with, what you can't get away with, transeptal puncture can be done very, very safely. And in fact, you can be very precise in where you want to go with it. So the key skills for transeptal complications are inversely proportional to the experience level. While they're rare, the complications can certainly be serious. Puncturing and cannulating an aorta is not a good day. Putting a wire through it's probably forgiving, but putting a sheath through it is not. And endovascular closure really should be confined to people that are masteries of this. Now, it would be wholly inappropriate for me to say only EPs can do that. That's ridiculous. I mean, I think that this is a skill set, and if you want to be doing this, you need to master that skill set, and that's all I would say. And so, are there interventional cardiologists that have this? Of course they do. Are there EPs that don't have this? Yes, absolutely. So I would say it's rather than be territorial about it. It's like if you have the skill set, then you should be able to do that. Now, cannulation of the left atrial appendage is trickier than we normally think about, as long as I showed you in the slide this morning. If you puncture in the right place, these things are almost self-finding. They'll just come to the appendage pretty easily. A little bit of counterclock rotation and you get right there. If you puncture wrong, then it's really difficult. And so I think cannulation is important. A lot of the complications related to some of the trials that are out there were related to this, not related to puncture. So the one thing I'll say is that structural heart guys live in the left atrium, EPs live in the left atrium. Non-structural interventional cardiologists may find it a little bit intimidating because they're used to being in coronary vessels. So don't just assume that because you're an interventional cardiologist, this will naturally come to you, because it doesn't necessarily come naturally to everybody. So it's an important skill set to have. And then finally, epicardial